Howdy my totally always tubular gamers. Thanks for coming back to the channel, really appreciate you, and if you're new here, maybe stay a while. Today I got another video for you. We got another list. We're going to be talking about perfect video game remakes.
Now, video games and remakes aren't exactly strangers. There's been remakes for video games for the last 20 plus years, but in the last couple years in particular, it really feels like that companies have been heavily leaning on remakes, sometimes more than new games. And it's not hard to see why. Like, it really isn't. It seems like an easy win for a company. I mean, when they remake a game, they don't have to create new characters or a new world or a new story. It's all already established. Sure, they might have to modernize and tweak the gameplay, but they don't have to come up with something brand new. And then they make the visuals all nice and spiffy, and voila, now you have a new $60, $70 game that you can sell. Additionally, there's not as much financial risk involved as it's not a new IP. It's probably not going to bomb. Usually when a game is remade, it's part of a beloved series already, or it's already deemed a classic. In many instances, games that are remade already sold well, and if they sold well once before, they're most likely going to sell well again. And nowadays we actually do have just straight hard evidence showing that yes, remakes actually do sell well and do make companies a lot of money. But outside of financial reasons, there's actually a bunch of benefits as to why you would want to remake a game, especially an older game. The game will immediately become much more accessible than that original older game. You know, the average Joe Schmo isn't going to have a bunch of old consoles ready at will to play these older games, and having them remade for a PS5, that makes it a lot more convenient and easier for people to play. Additionally, there's a ton of people that weren't able to play the original release for a variety of reasons. Maybe they weren't alive, maybe they weren't into games, they weren't old enough, they just weren't in the right place in their life to play video games. There's a ton of reasons why they didn't play that original release, but now they might be able to play it. Additionally, some games haven't aged all that well. What we considered cutting edge and acceptable back 20 years ago might not be acceptable nowadays, and the gameplay might be clunky or stiff or just not that fun, and they can remake it and make it more in line with modern standards. And of course, touching up the visuals, that usually is a must. But as you can see, there's a bunch of pros and cons as to why you'd want to remake a game. And so today's video, I want to talk about, as the title implies, perfect remakes. Remakes that are virtually perfect and are able to capture that original game's essence, gameplay, themes, narrative, etc., and basically make the original obsolete. Now, I'm not saying the original game is obsolete and it shouldn't be played by anybody. I'm just saying these are games where if someone asked you, hey, should I play this game? You can immediately go, oh, just play the remake. There's no need to play the original. The remake captures everything from that original game and is better overall. And so I have a list of around 10 or so games that I believe are, quote, perfect remakes, where they make the original basically obsolete. Like, there's always going to be inherent value in going back to the original, and for all of these games, I actually did play the original, and then I played the remake and went, wow, this is so much better. The gameplay's modernized, it looks better, and it still retains everything I loved about the original game. There's no real reason to go back to the original game now. Like, outside of maybe nostalgia, for all of these games, I don't really see a reason why you'd want to play the original over the remake. The remake is just that much better. And again, I'm not shitting on the original games. It was remade for a reason, and we're always going to have that original game. You can't take the original from us. If you don't like the remake, then you can stick with the original. There's nothing wrong with that, and everyone has their preferences. This is just my opinion, and I believe that these remakes are significantly better than the original games. And so I've already prefaced enough. Let's get right into it.
And as always, please like, share, comment, subscribe. Any support is truly greatly appreciated. We got the Patreon and the super thanks. Let me know what game you want to see get remade in the future. A lot of people have asked me, hey Jonathan, what game you want to see remade? I'll tell you, Twilight's seen it on Wii. I really hope this game gets remade. Underrated gem, not experienced by enough people. It desperately needs to be remade. But let me know what you want remade.
Now, when I think of perfect video game remakes or shit, when I just think of video game remakes, the series that comes to my mind first is Resident Evil. Resident Evil has been remaking its games for the last 20 years. It started all the way back on the GameCube when they remade that original Resident Evil, and they're still doing it nowadays. Resident Evil 2, 3, and 4 have been remade. But which of these games am I choosing as the perfect video game remake? I'm actually going with Resident Evil 1. I think the RE1 remake is a perfect remake of the original game, to the point where I don't really see any reason why you'd want to go back to that original game outside of some really funny voice acting. This game really just improves on everything from the original game. First off, the visuals are fantastic. This is a GameCube game. It looks phenomenal. Like, it even looks really good nowadays. It just stomps all over what the original game had on the PS1. 1. In my opinion, it has a much stronger atmosphere and vibe than the original game. The original game was spooky, but this game, it really just has a different vibe going for it, and I think they captured what they were trying to do with the original game and then some. I love the vibe of the GameCube version. And the voice acting is just all around a hell of a lot better. The original has some of the worst voice acting you'll find in a game, and it's really funny. This, yeah, it's quite a bit better, but outside of the presentation, I think the gameplay is better as well. The controls are all around better, you're given more options to control, it's a lot smoother, the navigation is better, some areas have been touched up, there's just a lot of quality of life improvements, and they faithfully recreated basically everything from the original game outside of the real life cutscenes. But honestly, we're really not missing all that much. You can watch those on YouTube if you're really curious. This is just so much better than the original game. I still think the original game is good. I'm not shitting on it. Don't get it twisted. It's still a good game. It's just the RE1 remake on GameCube and now modern consoles is just so much better, man. It's like they grabbed everything from the original game and improved it even further, not just from the visuals, but every standpoint. Now, I was really tempted to have the Resident Evil 2 remake on here as well, but I didn't include it at the end of the day because I still think there is a lot of value, and I don't think the original RE2 is obsolete compared to the remake. It still is pretty awesome. RE3, yeah, no, that's not a perfect remake. And then RE4, yeah, you could make the same argument as 2. I still think there is enough value to go back to the original that it's not obsolete. But I will immediately say I prefer all of the remakes over their original games. Outside of RE3, that we just don't really talk about. But the RE1 remake, this is a perfect remake that I think should be experienced by anyone who likes the genre. And so our next game is Mafia Definitive Edition. Now, the Mafia series, I actually quite like these games. Even Mafia 3, I enjoy a lot of aspects of it, but Mafia Definitive Edition is one of the best games in the series. Now, I don't hear many people talk about the original Mafia nowadays, and there's a couple reasons for that. While the original Mafia was considered pretty good for the time, I'll be real, this game has been obliterated by time. Coming back to the original Mafia in current year is very difficult. This game has just aged like shit, to the point where I would say really the game isn't very good anymore. It's just too antiquated for its own good. Like, the controls aren't good, a lot of the missions are brutally difficult with no checkpoints, the race sequence is just terrible all around, and while the vibe and atmosphere and story is still pretty good, unfortunately you probably won't be seeing most of it since you'll just be dying over and over and retrying missions, and it's just not a fun experience. And that's why I'm so glad that they remade this game. Mafia Definitive Edition takes everything that was good about the original, like the story, the characters, the atmosphere, and the setting, and puts it basically with Mafia 3's gameplay. So now instead of being an awkward, clunky, stupidly difficult shooter, it's a very competent third-person shooter with decent cover mechanic and solid gunplay. The driving is just a massive improvement on what the original game had. The original game really just did not control well, and this controls a hell of a lot better. The racing sequence is just 10 times better. I actually enjoy the racing sequence here. Unlike the original where it was just hard as fuck. Like, seriously, it was stupid hard. Here, the difficulty is much more adjusted. There's actually checkpoints. You're not going to spend an hour on a 5-minute mission because you keep dying at the end. There's just a lot of quality of life improvements. The visuals are very good as well. I think this is a good looking game, and then the story, the characters in the world are still just as good as they were in the original game. They're arguably better now thanks to even stronger performances and a much more fleshed out world. It's also much more widely accessible on modern consoles and runs better on the PC. There's really no reason to go back to the original game at all, in my opinion, these days. The Definitive Edition just destroys that original game. Can't say the same for Mafia 2 Definitive Edition or 3 Remastered, but Mafia 1 Definitive Edition really is one of the best in the series and is a perfect remake. And so our next game might ruffle a few feathers, but I have the Demon's Souls remake that was released on PS5. It was a PS5 launch title, and I think it is, yes, a perfect remake. Now, I remember when they announced this, a lot of people were scratching their head going, why are they even remaking this? The game's barely even like 10 years old and it's still aged pretty well. Well, if you actually go back to the original Demon's Souls, you can very well see where the game has aged. And not just with the visuals, which weren't even amazing for the time, but like the controls, the feel, and the flow of this game, it's very different from even Dark Souls. And the Demon's Souls remake, in my opinion, on PS5, really actually brings it more up to par with the Dark Souls series and of course Elden Ring and all of that. When it comes to the visuals, visuals, I think it looks amazing. This game looks freaking phenomenal. It destroys the original game when it comes to the visuals. Granted, it did come out a decade later, but yeah, it looks a hell of a lot better. It's a lot more smooth and steady, and there's no frame rate issues like the original. The online is another thing I'll bring up immediately that has been significantly improved. I don't think the original game even goes online anymore, so this game immediately is just an improvement in that sense. You can actually still play online. When it comes to the gameplay, I think it very faithfully recreates the original game, but they do touch up the controls and some of the navigation user interface and make it a bit more friendly to new players or casuals. For instance, you have an inventory limit in this game. No other Dark Souls game has an inventory limit, but this one actually does, and in the original, if you were full, you just couldn't pick shit up. Here, it gets sent to an item box. This is a great quality of life improvement that I think a lot of people can appreciate, like myself, where I went, what the hell, there's an inventory limit? Dark Souls never did this, but everything gets sent to the box. A great quality of life improvement, and there's a couple like this. I have heard some people say that the remake does not accurately capture the vibe or the aesthetic of the original, but I kind of also disagree. I think it is able to capture it. Sure, it might not be as dark and depressing as the original, but I like the vibe and aesthetic they're going for here. It's definitely a mood. This is another instance where I just don't think there's really any reason to play the original game nowadays. The game is on PS5. It looks and plays just as good as it did in the original game. It's still incredibly difficult, but it's been touched up, and it's for a newer audience of people who are very ready to accept a game like this versus in 2009 when they went, what the shit is this? I'm sure some people are going to disagree with me here, but I think the Demon's Souls PS5 version is much better than the original. And here we have Halo 2 Anniversary. Now, the original Halo 2 is an absolute legend. It is a certified classic and one of the very best Halo games of them all. The game still holds up incredibly well nowadays and is one of the very best first-person shooters of the 2000s. But Halo 2 Anniversary, in my opinion, is even better than the original. In my opinion, it grabs everything that was great about the original and really improves the graphics. It's much more of a one-to-one remake, and what's really awesome about Anniversary Collection is if you don't like the new graphics, you can, at the push of a button whenever you want, switch back to those OG graphics and see how they looked back then, and you can even compare and contrast, which is really cool. The gameplay really is virtually identical. It's still a fantastic first-person shooter that has an excellently paced campaign with some really great weapons, gunfights, set pieces, level design, and enemies. Seriously, a lot of the levels in Halo 2 are some of the best you'll find in any Halo game. I really love pretty much every level outside of that Jackal Sniper alleyway. That level can just fuck right off, especially on the harder difficulties, but this remake absolutely captures that original essence of Halo 2. How awesome the gunfights were, they're just as awesome here, if not even better. The excellent AI has been retained, the controls are just as good as before, and then the graphics are way better, and I really like this game's visual aesthetic. I think it looks really nice and it captures what they were going for with that original game, just, you know, on a modern console. The OST is great also. It's been redone and I love it. I actually really enjoy this new version, and I'm pretty sure you can listen to the original if you want to as well, so you get the best of both worlds here. And I think the last thing to bring up with the remake is the fact that the multiplayer is still very much alive in an official capacity. The original Halo 2's multiplayer is legendary, and here it is preserved, and you can still play it even nowadays. Sure, there's always been a bunch of issues with the Master Chief Collection, but it seems to be working nowadays, question mark. I've had some fun with Halo 2's multiplayer in the Anniversary Edition, and I think most people have as well. Now, when I was originally making this list, I did think about including Combat Evolved Anniversary, but to be honest, I really don't like how that game looks aesthetically. I don't think it captures the vibe or the atmosphere of the original game. Sure, it's the same gameplay wise and it's still just as good as before, but I see too much value in playing the original over Combat Evolved Anniversary. Maybe that's a hot take, but yeah, I just don't really like how Anniversary looks. Halo 2 Anniversary though, oh yeah, no, this game slaps. I think it's better than the original and it's way more widely accessible. And so here's the game that really inspired this entire list to begin with, and that is Yakuza Kwami. Now, I recently just discussed the Yakuza series, but as I was talking about Kwami, I really realized that there is no reason to go back to the original game now that Kwami exists. The original Yakuza was a pretty good game for the time. I think it still has an amazing story, world, and characters, and the soundtrack slaps. The soundtrack is really good, but the gameplay has just aged like shit, specifically the combat. The combat is just not good. Additionally, the navigation isn't so great, and thematically, this game is pretty different from the other Yakuza games, and Kwami really improves all of that. They just overhaul the combat completely, making it more like Yakuza 0's combat, which is a hell of a lot better. It's from a third-person perspective, so the navigation is a lot better. They've updated the side content and made it more in line with the other Yakuza games. Thematically, it feels more like the other Yakuza games, and the story's been expanded on as well. The story was the best part of the original game, and they even made it better here. Graphically, this game looks a hell of a lot better than the original as well, and while the aesthetic and vibe and just tone and atmosphere in general is a little different from the original, I think it is better and more in line with what you would expect from the Yakuza games. One negative I do actually have is I don't think the music is anywhere near as good as the originals, but that seems more like a nitpick and really minuscule compared to all the good that this game does. There really is no reason to go back to the original game now. This game is way more accessible, it looks better, it's more like the other Yakuza games, and it's a hell of a lot more fun. And everything I just said for Kwami 1, I could pretty much say for Kwami 2, including the music not being as good. Kwami 2 is a much better game than the original, and there's really no reason to go back to either of the original two Yakuza games when Kwami exists. Actually perfect remakes, in my opinion. And so our next game is the Super Mario RPG remake. Now, I love the original Super Mario RPG. It might be my favorite Super Nintendo game of them all. I've played through it several times. So when they announced a remake and I saw it, I got real excited. And after playing all the way through it, in my opinion, this game is way better than the original. And there really is zero reason to ever touch the original game again. Unless you feel like really nostalgic for the original graphics, there's just really almost no reason to go back to that OG game. What's crazy is how well the original game has aged. It has aged incredibly well, and so they didn't even really have to touch the gameplay up all that much. They did though. They made it even faster than before. It's a little bit more fluid. They added a new system here and there, and it just flows a lot better than the original game. The original game flowed incredibly well, but this, it's awesome. They added a little bit of extra content here. They made the interface better and just modernized things. On top of that, the presentation is fantastic. I love how this game looks. They perfectly got the look of the original game, but brought it into the modern era. I think it's beautiful. It's one of my favorite looking Switch games. It just looks awesome. The music has been retained as well. You can listen to the OG stuff, but the new versions are fantastic. This game has a wonderful, delightful soundtrack. In fact, this game, in one word, is delightful. One of my favorite RPGs of all time has been remade. It's better than ever before. It plays better. It's faster. It's beautiful. And as always, it's widely accessible. The original game had been re-released a few times, but this is on the Switch and everybody can go buy it, and I really hope now that we can actually get a sequel. I really doubt it, but maybe one day we'll actually get a sequel. There is hope now. I hope this game sold well though. Regardless, I believe this is a perfect remake. There is basically no reason to play the original now because this version just rules. It's awesome and I love it. And so our next game is not actually one game, but 3 games. It is the Spyro Reignited Trilogy that was done by Toys for Bob. Now, I love the original Spyro Trilogy on PS1, some of my favorite PS1 games of all time. So when I saw that they were remaking this, I was real excited. And after playing these, I was not disappointed. I actually think the original trilogy has aged pretty well. They're all very solid 3D platformers. Some of them are better than others, but I think all 3 of them are good, and there's still a bunch of merit to playing those original games. But this remake is pretty sweet. The gameplay is pretty much the same as the original. Sure, the controls have been touched up a little, there's a few quality of life improvements here and there, and it just does control and feel better, but for the most part, the gameplay is almost identical. Where this game really shines is with the presentation. The original games looked good for the time, but this remake, all 3 remakes look fantastic. These look awesome. They look like Pixar movies. They look so good. It's so vibrant and alive. Like, I love the visuals. They really pop here. It looks spectacular. As a kid, this is what I imagined those PS1 games look like. They just felt magical and mystical and like a movie to me. And you know, nowadays I look at the PS1 games and I go, yeah, they don't exactly look like that. But this remake, oh, it is so good in the presentation department. I think it really kills it. And I think the soundtrack, the new versions are pretty good. And then all of the gameplay, like I said, it really is retained from the original. It's just as good as before. There are some modern tweaks here and there, but I really don't don't have any issues with it. I might have a nitpick here or there, but for the most part, I think it is a very faithful recreation of the original 3 games. I did think about including the Crash Insane trilogy, but similar to say Resident Evil 2 and 4, I actually still see a lot of value in playing the original. I don't think they're obsolete thanks to the remake, especially Crash 1 where the physics were very much changed in the Insane Trilogy remake. But with the Spyro Reignited trilogy, yeah, I could never go back to the original games now. I mean, the Reignited trilogy is just awesome. It's much more available than those original games, and it really does recreate the magic that were the original games for me. Another positive that I think these remakes lead to is that we actually are going to get new games in the series. It happened with Crash, and I think it's going to happen with Spyro. I think we're going to get Spyro 4 at some point. I don't know when, but I am very hopeful. If Crash got a 4th game, Spyro can get one too, and it was all thanks to this awesome remake that I very much recommend. And so here I got another newer remake, and that is the Dead Space remake that came out in 2023. Now, the original Dead Space came out in 2008, and it really hasn't aged much. The presentation is still very good, and the gameplay loop is very strong. It's very modern still. It holds up incredibly well, and if you had told me, hey, they're gonna remake Dead Space like a couple years ago, I'd be like, why? The original game still is really good. But then I saw the remake, and then I played the remake, and I can tell you, yes, this is better than the original game, and there really is no reason to go back to the original game unless you loved how the original game looked. This game captures everything from the original game and improves it. Obviously, the first thing to bring up is the presentation. This is a beautiful game. It looks absolutely incredible. The original game still looks pretty decent, but this game looks phenomenal. It looks so good and is the biggest improvement on the original game. The story has also been improved a little bit. Isaac can now talk, which he didn't in the original game, and there's just a lot more dialogue than the original game. I like it. I think there's more world building, and I think it creates a more cohesive, stronger narrative, but that is just my opinion. When it comes to the gameplay, they really didn't change much. It actually is incredibly similar to the original game. Yes, the controls are touched up, the feel is better, and a few sections are improved like the anti-gravity sections, but for the most part, it really is the same gameplay you know and love. It's aged incredibly well, and it still feels great all these years later. And so with this, after I finished the remake, I thought about it and went, why would I ever want to go back to the original game? This game is just that game, but slightly better. I think it gets everything from that original game and improves on it by a little bit. They even kept the original ending in, which was interesting to say the least. Just a really solid remake overall, and if you like Dead Space and haven't tried this remake, I really advise you to, because it'll be the Dead Space you know and love. It just looks a hell of a lot better. And so our next game is actually 2 games. It is the Destroy All Humans 1 and 2 remake. Now, the original 2 games are cult classics. They're some of the kookiest, wildest games from the 2000s, and people absolutely loved them. And they actually were regularly re-released, and they're very much playable on modern consoles. But these remakes really improve a lot. Despite how beloved those original 2 games are, if you come back to them nowadays, you'll see that they haven't exactly aged well in a few areas, like the controls, the feel, the shooting, and the UFO segments are not exactly amazing or as great as you remember. They certainly weren't for me, and these remakes seek to rectify those issues. The first thing to bring up though is the graphics. These are both very good looking games. The original 2 games were very budget and had a certain aesthetic about them. They had that 2000s look and feel and vibe to them. They had the piss aesthetic going on. All of that's been dropped, and the game looks very good now. I think the models might look weird as fuck, but crypto looks good and the environments are very nice. Additionally, the frame rate was kind of ass in the original 2 games at times, and that's just not an issue here. Now, when it comes to the core gameplay, for the most part, it's the same as the originals. It just has been modernized. It's been tweaked, and there's some quality of life improvements. It feels way better than the original games. The original games feel kind of awkward to play now and clunky at times. These control like normal third-person shooters, and I think they actually do feel good, and the shooting does feel nice. The weapons are just as great as they were before. They're very unique, fun to use, and the game just feels nice, and flying around the jetpack feels great. The controls are just way better. The shooting is way better, and it really doesn't take any time to get used to, unlike the original where I was just kind of like fucking around. It felt like for a few minutes till I actually got a good grip on the controls. The UFO segments are way better. In the original game, they were okay, but they're really awkward when it comes to the controls and some of the angles they'll put you at. Here, it's more like the later Destroy All Human games and just feels nice. On top of all of this, there's some quality of life improvements. They have added a few extra things to do and see. There's a new gadget here or there to use, and there's just more content, and in my opinion, it's a better experience. It also feels like it's paced better, maybe just because the game might be slightly easier thanks to the better controls, but I thought the pacing and flow of both of these games was just better. When it comes to the story, the writing, and the characters, really nothing was messed with here, and I think it's just as good as it was in the original. I think it captures the vibe of the original, and is still very unique in today's gaming landscape. It was unique then, it is now, and I still very much enjoy it. I know these games aren't everyone's cup of tea, but I really do recommend these remakes, and there's really no reason to play the original 2 games now. And so our last game of the day is a very recent game you might have heard of, and that is Persona 3 Reload. I want to give a shout out to Atlas for sending a code, very much appreciated, but Persona 3 Reload is a fantastic remake of the original game. Now, I played the original version of Persona 3 on PS2, and I very much enjoyed it. There was a ton of things I loved about that game, like the story and the characters and the music and some parts of the gameplay, but there were some things I really hated in that game. Not being able to control your party members, the pacing of some areas, and I just wasn't huge on some parts of Tartarus. Maybe that's a hot take, but there were some issues I had with Persona 3, and I never played the PSP version. That version is just totally foreign to me. And so I jumped into this remake expecting, some basic quality of life improvements, but that was really it. But after playing quite a bit of it, wow, this is an excellent game. This is a much better game than the original Persona 3. And while I am sure there are plenty of people who will prefer the original thanks to its atmosphere, presentation, or the original soundtrack, I think this remake blows that original game out of the water. I think from a graphical standpoint, it is leaps and bounds above anything else we've seen from the Persona franchise. Seriously, this game looks great. I love its aesthetic, and the menus are just straight up gorgeous. They look amazing in this game. The gameplay is really refined and really just kind of has Persona 5 or Shin Megami Tensei 5's gameplay, and it's a lot smoother, it's faster, it's less clunky. The pacing overall is just better, and there really is some quality of life improvements, and grinding is way better than it was in the original game. Dungeon crawling is just significantly better than anything Persona 3 and 4 had. It is great here. It's not clunky, it's really smooth, and maybe it's the camera shift, but it didn't feel like Tartarus was getting pretty repetitive, or I wasn't seeing the same layouts over and over like I was in the original game. I think the gameplay really just is way stronger than what the original game had. The production values are way better also, like almost the entire game is voice acted. In the original game, like all the social links, there was barely any voice acting. Here, it's fully voice acted, it's great, I love it. This game is just so much more alive, so much more realized than the original game that I just could never go back to the original game now with how good this new version is. And yes, I know not everything from all the versions of Persona 3 are here, like the answer or the female protagonist or anything like that. I have a good feeling they're going to just add them in as DLC or re-release Persona 3 again. Adding them in some way. This is Sega we're talking about. I'd be really genuinely shocked if in the next 2 or 3 years we have Persona 3 Reload that does not have the answer and all those extra bonuses, but for the sake of this video, I'm just counting the original Persona 3, and I think it is a perfect remake. There's no reason to go back to the original game, in my opinion now, outside of maybe listening to some tunes, because I do love that original soundtrack, but gameplay-wise, yeah, no, this game just stomps it into the ground, and it's what I'd rather play. But there you have it, some quote perfect remakes. I'm sure I upset plenty of people by saying that these are better than the original games, but hey, you can always play the original games as well. We live in a world where you can have both of them, unless you're Warcraft 3, then you're fucked. But in the end, remakes, they ain't so bad. There is some good that comes from them, sometimes.
Well, that's it for this video. Hope y'all enjoyed it. Please, as always, like, share, comment, subscribe. I'm a one-man army out here, no team or anything like that. And our secret code word today, you made it to this part of the video, comment Twilight, because I'll tell you what I'm doing right after this video's over? We're going to be playing some Twilight Scene It. Oh yeah, we're going to have a good night. It's a good Saturday night. See y'all later.